We work too much. This is a very recent phenomenon, putting us out of step with our ancestors and with nature. 20th century anthropologists, interested in the evolution of work, looked back at Stone Age societies, and what they discovered was surprising. They found that virtually all Stone Age people worked an average of just 4 to 6 hours per day. They also liked to work in bursts, a fast day followed by a slow day. Something like 8 hours of work, then 2 hours, then 8, then 2. Fast, slow, fast, slow. Anthropologists also found that pre-capitalist societies had their own ways of measuring time. They would measure by how long it took to accomplish a specific task, cook a meal, or walk a certain distance. Interestingly, when you compare these different cultural markers, they were all somewhere in the ballpark of 30 minutes. It seems that in a world without clocks, measuring the day in 30-minute chunks just felt natural. To get a deeper look, we can examine medieval Europe. For most of human history, work was agricultural. So when we think of medieval workers, we should be thinking of people in fields, not cities. The medieval workday was incredibly flexible. People would trickle in at their own pace. The employer was expected to provide some food, so the first hour or so was often spent chatting and having a bite to eat. After a couple of hours in the field, there would be a mid-morning break that could last from 30 to 60 minutes for another bite to eat. When the sun was high and the day grew hot, work would stop for an extended period, maybe 2 or even 3 hours. This period began with a large midday meal, what we would call lunch, and was followed by, believe it or not, a nap. In medieval Europe, siestas were an everywhere thing. After returning to work, people would intensify their pace to finish everything up for the day. If they were done by mid-afternoon, they could go home. During the busiest times, like harvest season, workers might be in the fields for 12 hours a day, but when you accounted for all the breaks, they were only working for 7 to 9 of those hours. Notice the numbers we're playing with here. Stone Age peoples and medieval workers both liked to work for 2 to 6 hours a day, even though they had no knowledge of each other. It seems this is just a natural pattern that humans like. The length of the breaks is also striking. Medieval workers measured the day in 30-minute chunks, just like their Stone Age ancestors. What else sticks out? The workers were constantly eating. Providing food was part of a worker's compensation, which relieved a massive financial burden. One other thing to note is that work was generally understood to be a thing that happened during the day, and a workday was broadly understood to be half of daylight hours. If there was an urgent need for people to work from sunrise to sunset, it was a gentleman's agreement that this would count as 2 days of labor. What can we take away from all this? Work used to be a lot more informal and casual. Labor and leisure were intermingled. One was expected to relax or even nap on the job. Unless there was a crisis, workers were not expected to experience great stress. The week always began at a leisurely pace. Monday and Tuesday were described as days with a holiday spirit. Thursday and Friday were fast days. Monday and Tuesday were slow. Thursday and Friday were fast. This echoes the Stone Age pattern of working. Saturday was payday, so it was a hurry-up and finish day, and under normal circumstances, a half day. After the week's work was done and everybody got paid, workers got a full day off on Sunday. By the 16th and 17th centuries, workers invented a new custom that disrupted this pattern, St. Monday. It was an unofficial holiday where absenteeism was permitted and even expected on the first day of the work week. People were still flush with cash from Saturday's payday, and Monday was a slow day anyway, so they just didn't show up. Employers learned to tolerate it, and workers gleefully looked forward to it. This was the real origin of the 2-day weekend. It didn't come from the government. It came from workers who did it themselves. Centuries before any law was passed, the mentality of our ancestors was so different from ours today. Whenever medieval workers could afford to stop working, they did. Medieval Europe was not a culture where people saved a lot of money. After a worker's basic needs for food, housing, and clothing were met, there honestly wasn't much else for them to spend their money on. This led to a phenomenon where the more they earned, the less they worked. To put it another way, medieval workers liked to spend most of their discretionary income on leisure. Workers also routinely took big chunks of time off during 3 major holiday periods: Easter, Midsummer, and Christmas. I would note that of the 3, only the December holiday period made it into the modern era intact. Things really slowed down in the winter. Days were short and the work was also short. Because of this, a tradition evolved called winter wages, where workers were paid half a day's wage for half a day's work. We're talking about a 4-hour workday at the very most. If you add in all of the breaks, this would be maybe 2 to 3 hours of actual work. When you total up the estimated number of days worked by medieval farm laborers, things become quite stark. Researchers have found that Spanish farm laborers did not work for 40% of days in a year. In France, the number was more like 49%. The English usually worked more, but during a labor shortage in the 14th century, they used their clout to create more time off for themselves, enjoying 51% of days free from work. The funny thing about these numbers is that they once again echo how people worked in Stone Age societies. Almost every other day off. Fast, slow, fast, slow. For a point of comparison, consider a modern worker working 5 days a week. In a calendar year, that worker has 28% of days off. Add in the 10 or so public holidays, and that worker now has 31% of days off. Add in 2 weeks of vacation, and that worker has 34% of days off. In order for a modern worker to even begin to rival the amount of time off enjoyed by a medieval French farm laborer, that modern worker would need to be provided with 3.5 months of vacation per year plus weekends and public holidays. Medieval workers were operating on a level so far beyond us, it's difficult for us to even dream that big. Up until the early modern era, workers were paid by the day. The length of a workday could fluctuate, but even during the busiest periods, workers might be in the fields for 12 hours at most. But as I've said, if you take into account all of the breaks, that might translate into 8 hours of actual work, and that was on the busy end of the spectrum. At other times, a shortened workday would often lead to less than 4 hours of actual work. That all began to change with the proliferation of mechanical clocks. Cities and towns began building clock towers in their town squares in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Arguably the most important clock ever built was installed at the Amsterdam Stock Exchange in 1611. The Netherlands were at the epicenter of the new capitalism fad that was sweeping Europe. This idea quickly proliferated to every stock exchange, and with this, the clock escaped the public realm of town squares and churches and entered the private realm of business. Clock mania had begun. Textile mills were the first businesses utterly transformed by the clock. A brain genius had the idea to connect their mechanical clock to a bell, which would ring to signal the beginning and the end of the workday. This was a profound cultural shift. Under the old system, workers were hired by the day and measured the day in 30-minute chunks. Now, workers were hired by the hour and measured the day in 60-second chunks. This was new, and it was confusing. Many workers just ignored the bell, but the capitalists cared. In fact, they developed an unhealthy obsession with the clock. Before too long, the capitalists were able to convince city governments to get involved, who began issuing fines to workers who were late for the workday bell. Let me say this again. If a worker who worked for a private business was 1 minute late for work, the local government would fine them as much as an entire day's pay. This kind of thing had never been done before. It had never been part of the unwritten social contract between bosses and workers. The capitalists just unilaterally invented this new rule out of whole cloth, and they did it by joining hands with local governments across Europe. Industrial capitalism and the heavy hand of the government, friends since the beginning. The owners of the textile mills wanted to change the culture of work, and they did. But they did it by basically beating workers into submission. Shortly after the introduction of the work clock, the capitalist class killed the customary afternoon nap that had been a part of the workday. For as long as people could remember, they also stopped providing food to the workers, which dumped an extra financial burden onto the working class. Meal times, which up until now had been long and informal and subsidized by the employer, were shortened and regulated down to the minute. The entire workday was squeezed until all of the air and all of the joy was taken out of it.